Okay, so yes, so again, welcome to the CRB conference. We're happy to have you here. Quite a big turnout, actually. There are a number of really great sessions, and we're happy to see all of you here. Just have, again, by show of hands, how many of you were able to read the case documentation in advance? Online? Oh, great, yeah. Great, super. All right, so we'll be relying on you to answer some of the questions. So you are here for issue spotting, preparing for an issue-focused review. My name is Suzanne Callahan. I'm a Citizen Review Board Field Manager in Jackson and Josephine counties, and I've been doing this about 14 years.
I'm Rebecca Ruggello, also CRB Field Manager in Tillamook, Clatsop, Columbia, and now Yamhill County. I was in Multnomah prior, and I've been here almost 12 years now.
So collectively, we'll share some of our wisdom, or we hope to. This session is really about going back to the basics. This is what we're going to cover today. We're going to go over some of the state audits and really the reason that these state audits are changing the way that we are making our findings and placing greater importance on some of the no findings. We're going to talk about the purpose of an issue-focused review, as well as how to maximize your prep time, and how to identify the primary issues, how to really focus on the information that we don't already know, and really what to consider. So again, going back to the basics, under each of the findings, what are the issues that we need to consider, and then potential questions under each of those findings. And hopefully by the time you leave, you'll have learned a few more techniques to help you prep these cases as well as conduct your reviews. So could we find out how many of you in the audience have been a board member for a year or less? Fair number. Great. This is a good workshop for you. 2 to 5 years. Okay, and then over 5 years? All right, the old pros. The old pros. All right. So, and I think it's almost easier for brand new board members to be trained to come on because we're constantly revamping our structure. Bill Wegner, I can refer to you. We used to have an open free-for-all process where we didn't have any structure to our findings. And then we started conducting our findings by the reviews, using the reviews as the structure and backbone of our review process. And that really helped us from ping-ponging around to several different issues. And now, again, we're giving focus to the key issues. Where do we really need to focus our time? What's the most important thing?
All right, so I'm going to give you a brief chronology of why we came up with this approach of issues-focused review. And really, this stemmed from the 2016 CSFR and the 2016 PK report. For those of you who are newer, you may not know what the CSFR is. It is the Federal Child and Family Services Review. The feds come in about every 5 or 6 years and look at all states and kind of evaluate their child welfare programs. And they ensure federal law standards are being followed, and they assist states in achieving positive outcomes for children and families. So as you are with our program, you'll be seeing a CSFR report about every 5 years or so. Governor Brown requested the Public Knowledge Incorporated to conduct an independent review of Oregon's foster care system in response to the cases of abuse of children in foster care. So that's what the Child Safety and Substitute Care Independent Review report refers to. We call that the PK report, based on the agency who did the review. So in 2016, the CSFR, Oregon did not do well. They did not meet several outcome measures and also systemic factors. So we failed. We did not do good at all. The PK report found that, among other things, that space availability was driving placement in foster care rather than the needs of children. And that pressure to find foster care placements was really compromising certification and licensing. So these negative things that we've been seeing in the news, these reports confirm it. It's happening, it's horrible, and our systems need to change. We have a CRB advisory committee. Did everybody know that? Do we have members on the advisory committee in the room? Okay, great. So the CRB advisory committee sent a letter to Governor Brown in response to the PK report. And our advisory committee shared the seriousness of the PK findings. And we acknowledge that the CRB, we haven't been approaching our review and the monitoring authority that we have with the necessary degree of scrutiny. And we committed as a program to making change and working with the courts and DHS to get better outcomes for children and families. And that really has led to this issue-focused review approach. Well, there's another audit listed up here. The Secretary of State's report, Child Welfare in Oregon, that was in January of 2018. Some of you may already know about this. That audit was to determine what changes and improvement DHS could make to better promote well-being of children in foster care. And again, Oregon's failing. That was the findings, and that the audit affirmed the findings in the PK report, and that we all need to come together and make some changes. So on the PowerPoint are listed some other findings: shortage of placements, high caseloads of caseworkers, chronic management failures, insufficient services, significant deficits in the care provided to children, and a lack of systemic response to decades of other reviews and audits.
So, right, this is nothing new, right? We've been failing for years. But when things come out into the press, I think our first speaker spoke that there have been 19 front-page stories in the news lately. When things become in crisis, that's when there is attention, right? There's a call for change. And that's really the focus of our program. We are Oregon's foster care review program. It is our responsibility, it is our statutory authority, it is our duty to make sure that we are holding accountable and making appropriate findings to safeguard the safety and well-being of children that are in the system. So if it's not going to fall to the Oregon Foster Care Review Program, then whose job is it, right? We collectively are doing this work. It's not DHS, it's not the attorneys, it's not the court, it's not the CRB. We collectively are charged with this work, and we have a very important role in that. And so that's really why we're going to a more specific issue-focused review rather than focusing on all of the information that we already know.
Okay, so purpose of issue-focused reviews. We came up with this approach probably about a year ago, the idea, and we've been kind of working out kinks and strategies to kind of figure out what's the best way to teach this to people and to really make a kind of a format that people can easily follow. Really, an issue-focused review is a way for volunteers to focus on major issues in a case and then appropriately weigh facts under each finding. And the goal is to help volunteers and staff really confidently make the findings that you deem appropriate and not let subtle pressures that might be coming from other people in the room impact what you really want to make known as a citizen. The purpose, it will help you maximize your prep time. We'll learn how to focus on key issues in the case. It'll allow for more efficient reviews with our time constraints. I think we always feel like we're rushing, and this is not something that we need to be rushing in. We'll be placing emphasis on key issues and missing information. Information that's not in the materials. What do we need to know that's not in the materials, and asking appropriate questions to gather that information. And really, again, the focus is on child safety. What do we need to do to ensure children are safe in their foster homes? And then we'll work on providing explanation of negative findings and kind of approaches to that so that we're not coming off demeaning towards caseworkers and just kind of ways to formulate our negative findings.
So again, issue focus are what are the key issues in each case? And we're going to talk about what you do at home when you prep a case in the next slide. But really it's looking at what's missing, right? Everybody that's across the table from you should, at least, have received the discovery information. They're living, breathing, this is their lives, this is what they're working on. We are doing sort of a paper audit preliminarily, and then we are doing our review, which is a transparent review process that we all participate in. But everybody across the table is living that case. We don't need to spend the majority of our time proving to the other people across the table that we've done our homework. And we don't need to prove that by regurgitating or restating all of the information that we already know. Our job is to use our findings and use our recommendations as the language to create change, to have an impact. In order to do that, we need to not just focus on the negative, that's not the point, but really to look at maybe a highlight of the issues that we do know, the information that we do know, and use that to segue into our questions. That's what we're there for, to ask the questions for the information that we don't already have. So that's the purpose. And as Rebecca said, we are under enormous time constraints. And I know a lot of you are having longer review days, overflow boards. We're cramming very complicated, complex cases into a really short amount of time. And it's hard. It's hard to cover all of the issues that we need to cover without feeling like we're running out of time and still saving time at the end of our review to make the recommendations that are so important. So as you're preparing for the case at home, you're all going to have a method that works for you, right? And I know that especially new board members, they really struggle at this because it takes so much time, right? It takes so much time to do your homework, especially for the cases in which you're going to serve as the lead. And again, everyone is going to have some sort of method that works best for them. But really, you're scanning the information that you receive all over as to get an overview, right? What's this case about in a few sentences or less? What's this case really about? And then you're going to make notes of any missing information. Okay, I didn't get a CANS assessment, all right? I don't have mental health screenings. I don't see any updates on medical. You're going to kind of make even a mental checklist of what are the things that aren't in this packet that should be in this packet. That's going to be a point of your focus, right? The information you don't have. And then identify key issues. What are your primary concerns when you're reading this information? And then, which is what we're getting into with the issue focused, what are you going to need to make a yes finding? If you have a lot of questions about missing information, you need to hear that those items are being taken care of, or you need to hear that those assessments or documents are available at the review. And then if you feel like it's an automatic no, right? Sometimes we're reading these cases and you're doing your homework and you can tell it's going to be an automatic no just because of the circumstances, right? In that situation, now we're trying to prepare ourselves with a few sentences for how you might explain or articulate your no. And doing that in advance helps you better prepare for a review. So we're going to go into a little bit about effective questioning. And a few years ago, there was an entire workshop on effective questioning. We could do another workshop on effective questioning, and we're going to just do like a little highlight version, Cliff Notes version of that now.
So effective questioning. I'm going to go over some things that I think we really need to remember in light of kind of the atmosphere that we're in now with the negative reports coming out to DHS. I mean, we're angry. This is really hard to review these cases knowing the circumstances that has gone on in the system and the challenges that haven't been addressed appropriately. It's hard. So we really need to provide an atmosphere that encourages the participation of parties. We don't want to present in a way that makes people shut down or in a way that makes them escalate so that they can't participate. We want to ask questions with respect and openness in a way that solicits answers and makes people willing to offer information when we ask questions. We want to make sure we develop our questions and make sure it's relevant to a finding, and that we're not just asking questions because we want to know about something, you know, curiosity.
I always love the curiosity question, I'm butting in, about, well, where are you working? Do they have a job? Or are you working? You know, or where are you working, especially in small towns? We don't need to know where everybody is working. But again, that's a curiosity question, right? There's a lot of things that we would like to know, but is it relevant to the finding? Not necessarily.
And again, you know, the findings are the backbone of the program and the focus of the review. So make sure everything's relevant to the findings. We don't want to ask questions that are already answered in the materials. Like Suzanne was saying, everybody knows that information. It was in the documentation. We want to ask questions that clarify data, expand on topics, fill in gaps, gather information that it's going to be useful to the court, and when they look at our report, information they don't already have, and bring the court current. We want to make sure we ask the correct person the correct question. And I think it's really important also that if we're disappointed in how a case was handled, if we get information from the caseworkers that, lacking information in our documentation, for instance, like lack of a mental health assessment or lack of a psychological evaluation, not to just say, you know, we're really disappointed in the materials that were submitted to us because we're not fully prepared, but really let our findings and our recommendations hold that message. I think that would probably go along with building relationships with caseworkers.
Your no findings, well, you're going to get into this. There's a whole other workshop on no findings, but your no findings are the ones that get the most attention, right? And we're not making them without valid reasons. The no findings are warranted. But how we deliver that's important. And again, the frustration often, right, no matter how long we've been doing this, is lack of documentation or frustration that the packets aren't complete or your material's not complete or you're really disgusted with the way a decision was made. Your findings will speak that message for you.
Do you want to talk about the who, what, when, or?
Yeah, the other piece on this Becky's bringing up is the who, what, when is a rule of thumb. And that really goes to asking the right person the right question, okay? So who does the finding reference? If this finding is about DHS, for instance, on reasonable efforts, right, then it's most appropriate to ask the agency about the services they're providing, and then to ask the parent's attorney to weigh in. And then what additional information is necessary? What don't you already know? And then really, what are you measuring? Are you measuring reasonable efforts toward adoption? Are you measuring parental progress? Those are the ways that you shape your findings and questions. Speaking of that, does anybody have any questions, or is anybody being bashful because you're mic'd? Okay, well, feel free, because we're going to get into the audience participation portion coming up now, which will be testing your knowledge and really working through this case. So, what to consider? In order to develop questions and make informed decisions, we have to have an understanding of what's required to make the findings. And again, this is kind of going back to the basics. We need to know what to consider under each of the findings so we know how to adequately evaluate that finding. So looking at the case materials, or for those of you who have already read the case materials, in a few sentences, maybe someone can just volunteer to just tell us in a few sentences, what is this case about? Not breaking confidentiality, but say you're talking to a fellow board member on the phone and you're trying just to give a real short summary. What is this case about? Volunteers? Mary.
Well, there are two girls. They seem to have mental health issues. They've been placed in mental health, and there have been 5 placements in 6 months, and nothing in the record explains that.
I can hear your frustration. Yes, so we've got 2 kids, 11 and 13, different dads, currently split, mental health services, questionable documentation, right? Pretty typical. So what we're going to do is we're going to give an overview of what to consider under each of the findings. Today we're really going to focus on findings 1 through 3 because we spend the bulk of our time in our reviews on finding number 3, and there's a lot to cover under that finding. But I will let you know that the full PowerPoint does include all 10 findings that relate to this sample case. Okay, finding number 1, here we go. Has DHS made a reasonable effort to prevent or eliminate the need for removal from the home?
So, again, we don't need to reiterate everything that's in our paperwork. So be brief in the summary. We want to know what efforts and services did DHS do prior to removing the child from the home? Did they make any efforts? Was there an attempt to make an in-home safety plan or a protective action plan? That would go to DHS efforts. Were there any resources available to prevent removal? Were there relatives that the children could be placed with? Were there friends? Were all parents identified? You know, how often do you see that you have mom and a child and they don't know where dad is, and next thing you know, the kids are in foster care, and then dad comes, they find dad, and 2 days later maybe, and the kids have already been removed. And again, ICWA. If ICWA applies, then the tribe needs to be contacted immediately and involved in the decision.
I think the pitfall to this finding is we get caught up in the chronology, we get caught up in the story. And sometimes the events are really disturbing. Sometimes the number of assessments is really disturbing. Sometimes the fact that DHS has not intervened at an earlier point. I have a lot of board members that say, yes, it's reasonable effort to prevent placement. What about reasonable efforts to intervene earlier? That's of concern. And we get really caught up in the nitty-gritty details that really, obviously, protective custody was warranted. We don't need to restate those findings. It's a very uncomfortable finding for parents, very uncomfortable. And we're talking about trauma-informed response. When we're going over and we are airing the worst errors that these parents have made in their lives in a setting, in a formal setting, it's a shaming, right? And it sets them off in a very startled, heightened response. So I always encourage board members to really limit your amount of information, focus on the interventions only. The other piece about this finding is we get questions about why do we even have to make finding number 1 if the court makes it a shelter, right? The court's already made this finding. It is required by statute that we also make the finding. It has to relate to Title 4E, federal reimbursement money. Okay, so that's the reimbursement money that goes back to the state of Oregon that reimburses them for foster care. If DHS Child Welfare gets a no reasonable efforts finding in a shelter hearing that they did not make efforts to prevent placement, then Title 4E funding is affected for the life of that case. It's really important. And by statute, we are required to make it, but again, try not to get caught up in the details. Okay, in our sample case, this is the information we know.
Yeah. So, basis for removal. The children were removed from mother's care due to founded allegations for neglect, lack of supervision, protection pertaining to substance abuse, residential instability, and domestic violence by the mother's partner in the children's presence.
Brief description.
And we titled Description of Circumstances. The children had only been living in Oregon with their mother for less than a month. They had previously been residing with relatives in California. The family was homeless and staying in various camps. Police had conducted a raid on the property in which they were living, and the family was asked to leave the mission when mother tested positive for methamphetamine. The mother had been hiding in fear of her partner. There were no services that could have prevented placement.
So would you have any additional questions? If you were at the review. Yes, question? Fathers. Where were the fathers? Yep, exactly. Any other questions that come up in reading this that you might want to know or ask? There is you won't have a full, because we really limited the amount of information you have, the description is pieced together from both the cost report as well as the case plan. You don't have a protective capacity assessment. You do have the basis of jurisdiction there.
On the basis of removal, yeah. The description of the circumstances, not all those factors were in your packet, but based on what we have up here. Any other questions?
The other thing that might come up is, again, you don't have the protective capacity assessment, but you have the children only been living in Oregon with their mother for less than a month. Where were they before they were living with their mother for a month? Were they with relatives? They were in California with relatives. So were those relatives contacted? And then lastly, the mother was at the mission. She had been asked to leave because she tested positive for methamphetamine. Well, now we have a housing issue. Is the reason for substitute placement because of lack of housing options? Or was it because she was using meth? Was there another housing option for this family locally? So just based on the, yes, question?
Well, I'm relatively new at this, but
Good.
I'm wondering, do you just accept the statement at the end, there were no services that could have prevented placement? Did there not have to be any documentation of possible things?
This is usually pulled right out of the shelter hearing and protective capacity assessment. No, you don't always take that at face value. Are there services that could have prevented placement based on your knowledge of the circumstances? That is the question to be asked. Tricia.
So how do we look at that if the court's already made a finding? Because it had jurisdiction by that point in time. So you could have potentially also had a shelter hearing. But the court's already made the finding, so aren't we then re-reviewing what the court already found?
We're not able to hear anything.
Okay, what Tricia does have a loud voice, but basically what she said is that the court has already made that finding, just as we talked earlier, right? The court's already made it at shelter hearing. We've already had jurisdiction. So basically, what's the perspective of CRB at that point?
Right. So are we then, the court's already made the finding, because hearings would have been taken place, the court would have made that finding. Are we then re-evaluating the court's decision? That's my question.
In a sense, short answer to that is yes. Short answer to that is yes. Mary.
One other thing, I'm never clear what the difference is substantively between reasonable and accurate. But in this case, what we have says that ICWA is pending, given to me as father. Given that it's pending, it should be active efforts.
In this situation, and the ICWA laws have changed, and those are a whole, what? Oh, the question was that she hasn't understood that in this particular case there was mention about possible ICWA pending on a father. I believe the issue was that the ICWA is pending response from the father. There is no reason to believe that ICWA applies in this case. And there is a whole other session on active efforts because ICWA laws have indeed changed. So maybe trick question, because we know you're unfair disadvantaged by having limited amount of information, but what would be your finding in this case?
What answers to the question, that their answers to our question.
Okay. Okay, well, that's fair. Let's go on to finding 2. Well, I think that's really valid. I think that, you all can, would most of you say yes?
I couldn't hear the question.
Well, basically, what would be your finding to that question? What would be your finding? And a board member said it would depend on the answer to the questions that we asked. So if you had good answers or reasonable answers to those questions, would your finding then be yes, DHS made reasonable efforts? Okay. Yes?
What are the consequences to the state if the court's saying yes, reasonable, and the board is saying no? What's the consequences to DHS?
It does not affect Title IV-E funding. Only the court's finding is going to affect Title IV-E funding.
Although I think DHS does take our no findings seriously, and that if the board doesn't have to agree with the court. You may have a different opinion than the court, and I don't think that's an invalid thing. But if there's concerns that the board had in regard to preventing removal, I think DHS would take that seriously and look at that, and maybe they would agree with you. don't know.
Yes.
You mentioned before if the removal was perhaps for a housing reason. If it was, and if there is no housing option, where does that leave us all?
Right? We have to estimate that all the time, don't we? Both on reasonable efforts to prevent placement as well on reasonable efforts for our finding number 4 toward reunification. That there are serious barriers to services often. And then we do have to evaluate that. If there really are no other options, is that reasonable? Most say yes.
And that's where I think it's also important to find out if there's family, friends, people who are looked at that these families or children could have been placed with to prevent removal.
Yes.
I think the key issue you're looking at one in relation to, the courts in visiting with the judge in our county, and he says, I focus on your no findings.
That's true.
And so if you say no on one, he's going to say, well, what did you see that I didn't see?
Correct.
And so if you really believe
right.
it's a no, you need to make the no and say why.
Absolutely, and thank you for that comment. I hope you all heard it, that in talking to his judge, that the judge focuses on our no findings, and if we believe something differently from the court, we might have information the court didn't already have. And that's very true. Again, what we have is what we read ahead of time. It's at the review that we learn additional information. And I will say there have been no findings based on what is said at the beginning of a case, or a parent will speak up, or the fact that the children were returned home perhaps too soon and came right back into care. There are reasons for no. We don't see a lot of no findings on number 1. Let's go ahead and go on to number 2, reasonable efforts or diligent efforts to place the child with a relative or person with a caregiver relationship.
So this finding has to do with placing children with relatives, placing siblings together, and not so much on concurrent planning. Oftentimes we get number 7 and number 2 combined, and it runs into concurrent planning. Well, what's the diligent relative search like? What are these people here for permanency? What else do we have?
So really it has to do with the type of placement, not necessarily the number of placements. So if they were placed with grandma and they were placed with grandma from the get-go, your answer is yes, they were with a relative and they have been from the get-go. And then if you're talking about additional relative searches, you can talk about that under finding 3 when you're talking about what kind of family members they have contact with, and then come back to it on finding number 7 when you're talking about concurrent planning. All of that information are what other relatives have you identified for backup. But if they're with a relative, that finding would be a yes. We also get into the appropriateness, perhaps, of the placement. That is more about finding number 3 when you're talking about child safety and well-being. Is the appropriate placement a good match? Question.
When you say that you can look at some of these issues, such as the relative search and finding number 2, 3, and 7,
Yes.
then you could actually find a no in 2, 3, and 7. It feels like you're slamming people.
So it wouldn't necessarily...
Instead of just figuring out which place it needs to go. Does that...
Yeah, I can't think of a reason there necessarily would be 3 no findings on 2, 3, and 7. So finding 2 if they're with a relative or with or not with a relative. You're looking at why aren't they with a relative or a caregiver. The only place that really comes in on finding 3 is yes, are they with a relative and are there family connections? But mostly it comes under concurrent planning. So again, it's about the type of placement. Are they with a caregiver, someone who qualifies for a caregiver? Are they with a relative?
And we also consider siblings being placed together under number 2.
The other big thing we see on this often is that there isn't a full relative search for perhaps both maternal and paternal, or if we have multiple dads, has there been a paternal search for all of the different dads? It's really limited, like they find a relative and they stick with that one relative. Let's look at our sample case.
So for the placement, the girls are placed in non-relative foster homes due to lack of available local relative resources, and they've had multiple placements since entry. They're currently in separate placements. Destiny is in a community foster home, and Tamia was placed in that home, but is currently at a youth shelter for stabilization. The relative search. DHS has obtained relative questionnaires from the parents. There's extended family in California. They've made a referral to Reconnecting Families, which is like a relative search program. An ICPC for the paternal aunt was declined due to lack of follow-through. Maternal grandparents are interested but cannot be certified. And in terms of the siblings, the girls have 2 maternal siblings, a brother who resides in California with his father and a sister who resides in California with an aunt. The father of Tamia has 5 biological children, ages 2 months, 1, 2, 4, and 5. So a lot.
So there's a lot to consider even under this finding, right? So that's what we know. What other questions might you have under this finding? Yes.
Our court often asks under number 2, wherever they're placed, and pretty much wherever they're placed if it's not a foster home, and even then sometimes, is this a potential permanent placement should the plan move that way?
Right, so she's asking about if they're potential long-term or willing long-term placement resources.
Because sometimes they know right away, and
Right.
sometimes they don't.
So, and what about in our particular case, in this sample case? Are there other questions that you would have if you were on this finding based on this information? Mary?
A couple of things. First, this is sort of not specific, but when you do things, there's kin, but there's also kith.
Yes.
And probably not here because she's new to things, but if they're placed with kith, a neighbor or a friend.
Yes, a kith placement. I'll repeat for you.
Yeah, is a kith placement sufficient to, be okay in terms of this?
Question had to do with kin and kith, and oftentimes they're placed with kin or kith. In this situation, is kith sufficient? Yes, kith is considered, there's relative, there's kith, and there's a caregiver relationship. That is considered sufficient. So what do we know about Tamia and Destiny? Again, separate placements. Would you have any additional questions on our sample case?
I don't understand what you meant by kin and.
Kin is blood related.
Oh, I understand that.
Yeah, and then kith would be if are you saying what it's kith? Are you asking the difference or what kith is?
You're using acronyms that I've never heard, so I'm sure I probably should have heard them, but.
Okay, yeah, that's a good piece of to know. So kin is going to be blood related, a relative or blood related. And then kith would be somebody with whom you have an already established relationship. They're not blood related, but they're close. They could be a family friend. Oftentimes we see step-parents, or we see ex-boyfriend, we see the neighbors that step up to be certified.
Yeah.
It's somebody that they already have an existing relationship with.
The DHS definition of relative is very long, and we could print it out for you, and so you can know all the different types of people out there that qualify as a relative placement. Question?
Yes, I would be asking, what about the father?
Good.
Yeah.
Right.
It says that he's,
What about the fathers?
that he's allowed CPS in his home, and they found him to be appropriate, but they did not do a full assessment.
And this finding does have to do with placement and relatives. So part of that what you'll be talking about is placement with her dad, which we would get under reasonable efforts when it relates to returning a child to a parent. We would come to that under finding number 4. But one thing that comes out of that would be, what about those paternal relatives? I don't think there was a mention. We have one paternal aunt was denied. It's not clear in this if there's been extensive relative search, right? But what we do know is that there's nobody locally, that this family came from California, and there's nobody locally. And as you know, when plans are reunification, if there's family in California, right. As you know, when plan is reunification, they try to keep, DHS tries to keep children in the local community in order to facilitate family and parental visitation. When they get placed out of state, that can sever or at least create a barrier to visitation. So oftentimes you hear this a lot, that there's no local relative resources. Other questions in the back?
How often should a relative search be done? Is there a period of time? And what type of relative searches does DHS do? Are there more than one outfit that does these searches, or?
Well, yes, relative searches have to start by policy immediately upon entry. There are letters that are sent. There also policy dictates that they are having contact with those relatives. They might have identified a relative and they can contact that grandma and say, hey, grandma, you got any other relatives that we don't know about? Then there's a number of programs such as Family Finders or Reconnecting Families. These are programs that are often housed within DHS Child Welfare that have search engines and computer software that goes out and traces family lineage. And so you have an extensive relative search done there. And that's a recommendation that you can often make, that if you don't see a lot of relative search efforts, you can make a recommendation that be referred.
So, but how much time in between? I was, in one of my boards, they said we should be asking consistently.
Relative searches have to be ongoing by policy. It is ongoing, but that's a very important question, and I think that's a good reminder for all board members, is we sometimes see that letters were sent out in the very beginning, right? And then there haven't been any efforts because maybe a child is with an aunt or with a relative, and then, oh boy, we get up to concurrent planning and whoops, aunt's not gonna be a resource. And meanwhile, the search for relatives has been dormant.
I think you can always ask at your reviews, when was the last relative search updated? And I often hear caseworkers say that on an annual basis, that they'll resend out letters or kind of reinitiate the search from the beginning.
Are those searches for relatives out of state as well? And how much
Yes.
effort is
Yes.
made to do that? Because I sometimes think, oh, it's an ICPC, and somehow the agencies aren't talking to each other.
Yeah, and that's what we need to ask at the review.
Yes.
We need to make the determination if it's relevant, or diligent, I'm sorry.
One more question, and then I want to get into finding 3, which is really where we're supposed to be spending the bulk of our time.
We frequently get a list of relatives that have been contacted and no result.
Yes.
What do we do with that?
You continue to ask about that. Continue to ask about the result. And again, letters aren't sufficient. Then let's look at trying to contact them by phone or other means. We want to get into finding number 3 because, again, this is where we spend the bulk of our time. And we want to give you some tips and suggestions about how to go about considering finding number 3. So we all know DHS has ensured appropriate services are in place to safeguard the children's health, safety, and well-being. A couple tips and suggestions is that you really ask your questions in order of importance. When you're at home and you're doing your homework in advance of your reviews, you're already identifying some of the key issues, right?
We want to make sure we prioritize our time, make sure we know the key issues. So let's ask the questions and develop the questions about the information we don't have so that we're best using our time. And we don't need to focus on what we already know. What do we need to know in order to make a yes? What's lacking that's going to make us make a yes finding?
We're going to get into categorization, right? We're going to spend some time on that. There's a number of categories that we need to consider when we're on finding number 3, and these are some of them. Some boards actually go through these categories in sequential order. We go through, we talk about all of the questions that relate to placement and safety, face-to-face contact, child description, community engagement, assessments, mental health, education. These are all sort of the checklists that we need to go through. So we're not giving you a prescription saying that you have to do it this way, but really in order to maximize your own prep time, you can kind of focus your issues on, okay, yes, that's been taken care of, this looks good, these are my questions, and you categorize your questions. Before we go into some of these and break them down under what to consider, we want to just give a couple minutes, want you to come up with what the major issues, like maybe top 3 major issues that you found in the sample case. Under number 3, yeah. Okay. So who wants to volunteer a couple of main issues that you see in this case? Just holler them out. Education, lack of educational supports. What else?
Multiple placements.
Multiple placements. What else?
Mental health.
Lack of mental health or mental health supports. Sibling visitation. Good. What's that?
Contact sheet.
Rights, like foster care bill of rights. Yep. Great questions. Well, that's one that we focus on in safety.
Last time the attorney saw the child.
Well, isn't that a hot topic right now, isn't it? Yes. But when we're looking at DHS placements, these are the key issues in this particular case. You named them. And already, those are mounting to some serious concerns, right? So you might already have some concerns about whether or not this might be a yes or a no finding. It does seem like a lot of information to cover, but by categorizing your questions, you're going to be more efficient, both when you prep as well as when you conduct a review. So first category is placement. The things to consider: type and appropriateness, stability of a placement, how many placements, how many caregivers have they had? In this case, what, 5, right?
6 for
What
one.
kind of care is this? This is shelter care. What's the number of placements? Is the number of the placements in the child's best interest? We're looking at that placement stability. And as we know, part of the reason that we're in crisis here is because we have a shortage. We have instability of placements. And does this placement meet the child's needs? Face-to-face contacts. Have contacts occurred every month and at least every other month in the foster home per policy? We, as a CRB program, I think, do a really good job at being the monitors of face-to-face contact. And we have to look at this in every single case, looking at documentation of not only has it occurred monthly, but where has it occurred? And are those dates and locations documented? And if it's an out-of-state or courtesy or even out-of-county, if there's a courtesy worker, are they getting the dates in quarterly reports? So that's kind of what to consider under those. Yes?
Is it every month, every 30 days?
Every month.
It is every month,
Every
which
month.
means if they miss a face-to-face contact, technically you could run into what, like 59 days, right? So these are some of the potential questions that you could ask under these subcategories. Any other questions you would come up with? You already brought up with foster care bill of rights. That has to do with
Sibling Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think when we're looking at child safety and asking about face-to-face contact, we need to make sure that we're asking foster parents, if they're present, caseworkers, what they're doing during their face-to-face contacts. What does the caseworker observe during face-to-face contacts? If the child's there, foster parent, tell us what the caseworker does when he or she comes into the foster home. Does he talk to the child individually? I see a hand in the back.
Holler it out.
I'm actually a former CASA just joining CRB, and so I just want to chime in. What I found was that there would be a box check that there had been face-to-face, but then when questioning, it's really important to sort of piggyback on what you just said about asking details. And the reason why that is because we found out that box was being checked when really it was a courtesy, practically wave at the facility.
Right.
So they would
Right.
tag somebody who was already, say, going down the Roseburg from
Right.
Albany, and they would just slide into, or Mentor rather.
Exactly.
slide into Roseburg, sign in, and that was a face-to-face.
Right, a face-to-face contact isn't, I saw you get out of the school bus, right? It's not a sight. There is some pretty clear policy about what has to occur in order to document a face-to-face visit. And as Rebecca said, some of the questions you could ask just simply is, when is the last time you visited and what did you observe? Or you can even ask the foster parent, when's the last time Susie came to the home and what'd you do? Right, what happened at that home visit? So, okay, back to our sample case. Let's just pick one of the girls.
Tamia? So we're going to talk about placement and safety for Tamia. Concerns?
What do we know about
What do we
Tamia's
know?
placement?
Shelter. Why is she there?
Why
is she in the shelter?
Why is she in the
Yep.
shelter? Okay. How many placements has Tamia had? 6 placements since her entry. Any other questions that you might have when you're asking about Tamia's placement or safety? Is she safe? Is it a long? Tell us about the shelter. Why is she at the shelter?
We can ask about
Maybe
the
how
sibling visits.
long will she be at the shelter? Are you seeing her more often?
Yeah.
Or are you even visiting? I mean, you wouldn't say it like that, right? Are you even visiting? Are you visiting her at the shelter?
Is she getting educational?
Yep. And we'll talk about under education, but specifically about placement, we're looking at number and stabilization and why. You know, is this the most appropriate? What we read is that she was moved there because of her emotional issues and threatening behavior toward her sister, but how long will she be there? And then how about the face-to-face contact? Again, some of just standard questions. Somebody already said, are you visiting her at the shelter program? That would be a good one. Somebody else also asked about sibling visitation with her sister, if that's happening.
So child, number 3 again, child functioning and a description of needs. Just real quickly, description of child's interests, child's activities. Are they able to maintain similar activities that they had while they were placed with their parents? Providing some normalcy to children.
There's a few CASAs in the room today, and I want to say that cost reports are absolutely essential for this, right? Because they give us a picture of who this child is. And so often we're reviewing this child on paper, it has to do with the negatives or the behaviors. We had a case just so recently where I think out of 200 pages of documentation, there wasn't a single word that described in a positive way anything about this child. It was all about her history, her past, her diagnosis, her terrible behaviors. It's important to have a little snapshot of who that child is, and that's also a prime opportunity to ask the parent, right? It's the prime opportunity at the beginning of that find to say, tell us a little bit about Johnny. Tell us a little bit about your son. How would you describe your son? Because it puts it into a positive. And community engagement, we do want to know if they're engaged in some sort of activities. We want to know that for every child. We have a separate finding for it when the plan is APLA, another planned permanent living arrangement, and the child is 16. But all kids should have access to community interests.
See a question.
Under child functioning and needs, it's also really important to take a look at the meds, particularly if they're on multiple psychotropics.
We have another section, another category for assessments and medical.
And again, just categorization, that's obviously a very important piece, but a little snapshot of it. Tell us who this child is and what are they interested in. So with Destiny, back to our case, with Destiny, is there any description in there of her? Maybe in the CASA report there was a description? Or what she enjoys? But again, this is the child that has had a lot of instability, and as opposed to focusing on the negative as a chance to find out, she's a friendly, social, intelligent child.
And again, asking the parents.
That she's adjusted. Mm-hmm.
And again, sorry, Suzanne. We're breaking this into categories as a way to bring efficiency to the review process. And so it's not just a back and forth and getting information from various people and talking about the same thing over and over again. If we talk about by categories, it helps us be more efficient in our review process.
So let's talk about assessments. Your field managers have probably sent you out some information. We are being much more strict, I think, about looking at both have the assessments occurred and also the timeliness of those assessments, right? So we're looking at when do those assessments occur. And often those are the documents or supplemental documents that may be missing from your packet. So those are information, that's something we would want to ask about is, did they have a nursing assessment? When was the CANS assessment? Have they had a mental health assessment? And all of those have timelines on them. Or most importantly, on children under 3, have they had a developmental assessment? And we seem to be missing a lot of those developmental assessments.
We might see in the case plan that a referral's been made, but not the actual results or that it has actually happened. So the policy says it has to happen, not just a referral.
And then we go into mental health supports and counseling. And again, we spend a lot of focus on this, right? Are they getting counseling? What kind of counseling? What's the frequency of counseling? And it's often good to ask maybe what the treatment plan is. That way we have an idea of if the treatment plan for their mental health counseling appropriately matches the behaviors that we read. Did somebody else have a question back here?
Well, I was wondering if you were including assessment for learning disabilities, because those are mentioned in the CASA report.
Sure, absolutely. And, we could get into that, into assessments or even under education. It qualifies really, either way. We want to be asking about educational assessments.
Suzanne?
Yep.
Could you talk about the importance of the timeliness of things occurring?
Yes, as I mentioned, as I just mentioned, all of these assessments we talk about, we want to know both if they've occurred and the timeliness when they occurred. And as I said, a lot of them are, we have nursing assessment is done by intake, CANS assessment within 60 days, mental health assessment within 60 days. And oftentimes, as Rebecca said, you'll get a referral, but you don't know that ever took place. Or maybe it didn't take place because they transitioned homes. We get that a lot, right? They
Changed
disrupted
counties.
placements, and because of the multiple disruptions, here we are at our 6-month review, and those assessments haven't happened.
What our boards have been seeing is that they show up like literally like a week or a month before the review, and it's just something's in place, and I think we're trying to focus on if that's not timely.
Right.
Our child's been in foster care for 6 months, and service
Right.
is taking place at
It's
5.
not timely.
That's not timely.
And again, we're weighing all these facts under the finding, so that very well may lead to a negative finding. Big question?
Maybe it's my county, or maybe because I've only done this a year, but wouldn't it behoove us to redo this form so it was like a category?
There's been a lot of discussion about that, and that might be coming down the pipeline here very soon.
I had to make my own. And
Yeah, I think a lot of board members have gone to this system. Again, it also prevents you from doing that ping pong approach with your other board members, like, oh, I have a question, and it's off topic, but it pulls us onto that topic, when really we want to finish talking about mental health services and we have to get back to it. It does say that, it provides that structure, and that's really what we're teaching you today as a technique that you can take back to your board, take back on your own homework. So in Tamia's case, mental health services, that was really questionable.
Right, we didn't have a report, we didn't know if it had happened, but we know she has very significant needs.
There weren't any intake nursing assessments. So again, a lot of questions around the assessments and if they're getting services. One of the children wasn't getting mental health counseling, and again, you're at a 6-month review. I saw another question back here.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it says in there that one of the girls didn't want to, refuses to visit the mother.
Yes.
I always have concerns about that.
Right.
And I always ask if they're receiving support services around that, like supervised visitation.
Right, therapeutic visitation. You have a child who doesn't want to visit with a parent, so what can be done to help facilitate that? Can that be a therapeutic visit? Can it be some family counseling? That's a very good point.
Okay, for a teenager to reach sports, and it's not
Education.
All right, so education. Some questions to consider around education. We have the IEPs that are very important to talk about here. Our caseworkers, are they familiar with the school counselor? Are they in contact with the child's school counselor? That get a lot of information that way. Concerns about children changing schools when they enter foster care. Let's see. Academic progress. Is there any other supports needed, like tutoring? Then we have independent living for children over 14. Talking about the transition plans, I forget what they call it, the ILP readiness guide, the checklists that caseworkers should be going over with teens before age 16, when they can actually enter ILP. Then we have a section, again, on health, medical, medication, making sure the annual med reviews are done for kids who are prescribed 2 or more psychotropic medications. And again, health, medical, medication, we have timelines per policy in DHS of children receiving medical exams, dental exams upon entering foster care. that we need to
And so we're
check on.
looking at that, sometimes dental hasn't happened and they're 6 months into the case and we hear that there's a referral issue or an insurance barrier issue. Well, they're 6 months into a case, a lot of these children have dental neglect. And then, we ask about immunizations. I always like to give the priority, and Rebecca laughs at me, but, if we're considering the whole hierarchy, even like this sample case, right? 2 very high needs children, multiple placements, split placements, lack of mental health services, lack of education, immunizations being up to date is on the lower end of the priority list. So we want to make sure that we get through some of these, big tag items first. With Tamia, are there questions about her education that you would have? Absolutely. Like what? What could you ask at the review? Yeah.
It's partly about the girls and it's also partly about DHS. So Wisconsin, and I believe Wisconsin now, they're failing all their classes and really are in
Yes.
desperate need of
We'll restate. We'll restate.
At the same time, in the only DHS thing I have says, oh, they're struggling in some classes.
Right.
But basically, what they're saying and what the...
Yes, so what Mary's bringing up is there's...
I hold them to account for that.
What Mary's bringing up, aside from more frustration, is that there's a big discrepancy between what's in the cost report and what's in the DHS report, right? And we're going off the cost report by saying these girls are failing all of their classes. So lots of questions perhaps around education, right? What's the status of their academic supports? Have they been evaluated? Not to mention one of the children had moved several times, several schools, right? Any other questions you would have on that subsection?
What have you done to help the schools get correct?
Has there been a transferring of records? That's an important piece. IEPs and school records from multiple placements, and perhaps including the ones from California in this case. Okay, and then parenting time and visitation.
Right, how often and where? Is it just once a week, which is not adequate, but usually what we see in cases. This is another place, always ask the parents about how visits are going, their perspective, if there's things that their children need that they're not getting. Level of supervision, we should be questioning the level of supervision. When can community visits start? Are there safety service providers that can assist with increasing visitation? Let's see, what else do we have? Sibling contact, other family members who are able to have contact with the kids and maintain connections. How often do we have relatives that show up at reviews and say, I've not been able to see my granddaughter since she entered foster care and I live in the same town? It's very, very frustrating.
So with this subsection on parenting time and visitation, are there questions? Sibling contact, I heard that would be a question. What's the level of sibling contact? Or a question back there was why, if she's refusing to have contact with her mom, is there anything that can be done for therapeutic visits? Are there any other questions that you would have in this sample case at a review about parenting time and visits? Go ahead.
A lot of times excuses are they don't have enough SS.
SSAs.
Yeah, SSA. And so what's the response to that? If the kid is supposed to be seeing them 2 or 3 times a week, and it might be once every 2 weeks, and the caseworker responds, "Oh, we don't have enough people that observe." So
They need to find.
That's the safety. That's where you want the safety service provider, a neighbor, a friend, somebody that can be approved to do visits outside of the DHS office. Yeah.
Okay, so lastly, if this was a review and you were at the end of finding 3, you've covered all of these topics, usually you as the lead are probably asking the majority of these questions and your fellow board members are jumping in, but you might be taking the lead on these questions. Before you make the finding, if there's a CASA present, ask them for any other input, ask the child's attorney for any other input. And before you make it, ask the board members, your fellow board members, does anybody else have any questions? Are we prepared to make a finding? And then please restate the finding. Because we spend so much time on this finding, it's good to restate the wording of it, because if you say, okay, finding number 3 is yes. Well, we just had 30 minutes on this finding. What was finding number 3? Especially true for people who are on the phone. Well, what was finding number 3? Please restate the finding. And that's true as far as your method for all the findings, really. Are we prepared to make a finding? has DHS made reasonable efforts, or has DHS ensured health, safety, and well-being? Okay, what would be your finding on this case for finding number 3? A little obvious, but it would probably be a no, right? For the reasons that you've already stated. We've got numbers of placements, lack of services, no documentation. So the finding would be a no. Okay, let's talk just a little bit. How are we doing on time?
We are almost done.
We're almost out of time, so we're just going to talk a little bit briefly on making a no findings
Right.
recommendations, and we'll quit there.
So presenting a no finding, it's hard to say no. It's hard to say no. You know, we want to say no, and it's valid that we say no. But how do we say no? So for our mock example here, here's a way that we could submit our no to DHS. Despite DHS's best efforts, the agency has been unable to provide stability of placement. The girls have experienced multiple transitions, including 2 brief respite homes. Destiny has had at least 5 placements, and Tamia has had 6 placements since entry. The girls have experienced multiple disruptions and have not received adequate educational supports. For this reason, the board is making a no finding.
Does that sound reasonable?
It's very clear.
Despite their best efforts, because I'm not sure they had best efforts there.
True.
Yeah.
They might not have had. They might not have had
Yeah.
best efforts. You know, we see a lot of no's though because of a lack of resources for reasons. That's
Yeah.
true in a lot of cases.
But it's not always true.
And then you wouldn't use that wording, right? And we as field managers, when we're typing up the report, will be very careful in how we wordsmith that, and we might not be so favorable. Question?
One thing that Deborah pointed out is right, is that you want to distinguish sometimes between the caseworker in front of you and being the head.
Absolutely. I'll restate. So Mary's saying
Yeah.
a lot of times what we need to do is we need to distinguish the caseworker from the agency of DHS. Oftentimes that caseworker that's coming before you might have had good efforts, might have done their darndest since they've had that case assigned, but as a totality with the agency, ultimately the answer is no.
Right. And we have another example up there for a caseworker that's done their hardest work trying to get services in place. If a caseworker has exhausted current available resources and they're trying to find appropriate placement match, for instance, we can indicate that the negative finding is reflective of a resource issue, not a caseworker effort.
Which is very much in line with what the PK report was saying, right? It's a lack of resource, it's a lack of stability of placement, and ultimately our no findings are going to help reinforce the agency's need for additional services, additional placements, additional financial support.
So when we ask these questions, these different categories, and the worker says, fill in the file and say, oh yeah, I did do this, or
Yes.
that has happened. That's enough for a yes finding?
Well, it might not be enough for a yes, but it might be enough to satisfy that question. And then you have to make an evaluation at the end in totality, right? But you might get some additional information at the review that say, oh, okay, then that probably isn't a no. That happens.
We don't have to be looking at the document.
No, no. Okay, before we end, we just want to go over a few of the recommendations in this case. Would you have any recommendations before I put them up there that relate to the findings that we just made?
Yes, I would recommend that the girls both be given an auto.
So DHS is to refer both children, both girls, from mental health counseling supports.
And that they, DHS get in contact with their schools about getting them tested.
DHS contact with schools.
So to make sure that they have the educational testing as well as adequate educational supports.
We also make a recommendation for a psychological evaluation. If you feel we get IQ testing.
A psychological evaluation.
Which might give you really good recommendations for a 504 plan.
So psychological evaluation could help feed the need of a IEP or individualized education plan.
Preface that by saying educational.
Yes, individualized educational plan.
No, the psychological has to be done by
There could certainly be some psychoeducational testing, yes, academic testing. So these are the actual recommendations. This case is an actual case. Names have been changed.
That's way too small.
I'm going to read it for you. Or
I'll read it.
Rebecca will read it for you.
Give you a break. So DHS continue the current placement for Destiny with no further moves. DHS develop a transition plan to return Tamia to the community foster home placement. DHS complete a thorough relative search to identify a stable relative resource. DHS RAP team ensure the children receive educational testing and adequate therapeutic academic supports. DHS establish visitation and family contact with extended family members. And 6, DHS staff this case with the AAG within the next 60 days to develop a viable permanency plan.
So this was a somewhat complex case, and today we only covered findings 1 through 3, and you can see that even that took quite a bit of time. There are certainly other issues in this case, and again, this PowerPoint, if you want to go online later, does cover all of the findings that relate to this sample case. That will be online. All of
On the
our
website.
conference sessions
It's on our website.
will be online.
It's on the CRB website where, yeah, all the conference materials will be there.
Anything else?
I think that's it.
I don't know. We have a final slide for you. Oh, look, there it is. We thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference, and thanks for coming. Other questions? Yes.